At exactly 3:07 a.m., the stillness of rural Montana shattered as a violent echoed from the old barn behind the Thornwood ranch house. Ezekiel Thornwood jolted awake, his chest tightening before his mind fully caught up with the sound. Another blow followed, wood cracking, dust falling, the unmistakable force of a powerful animal striking the wall. Ezekiel sat up slowly, gray beard catching the pale glow of moonlight through the window. In more than 40 years of ranch life, horses panicked, yes, but they did not persist like this. Whatever was happening in that barn was deliberate. Ezekiel pulled on his worn jacket, his boots scraping softly against the floor as he stood. His wide-brimmed hat rested on the chair beside the bed, and without thinking, he placed it on his head, a habit older than grief, older than memory. As he stepped outside, the cold bit into his skin, sharp and awake. The barn loomed in the distance, its wooden slats breathing out dust with every from inside. With each step, the sound grew more violent, more urgent, and something unfamiliar twisted in Ezekiel's gut. Not fear, but the sense that he was late for something important. Inside the barn, lantern light revealed Grimlock rearing in his stall, a massive dark horse with muscles coiled tight beneath his skin. His hooves slammed the same section of wall again and again, splinters exploding outward. This was no blind frenzy. Ezekiel froze, watching carefully. Grimlock would strike, pause, glance toward Ezekiel, then strike again, always the same spot. The horse's eyes were wide, but clear, focused, as if he were pointing rather than attacking. "Easy, boy," Ezekiel said, keeping his voice steady as he stepped closer. Grimlock snorted sharply, then lowered his front hooves, breathing hard. He did not retreat. He waited. Ezekiel's eyes followed the damage, noticing how one plank had split clean through. Cold air seeped from behind it, wrong somehow, carrying the scent of damp earth. Ezekiel frowned. That wall backed onto solid ground. He knew. He had helped build this barn himself decades ago, side by side with his father, Silas Thornwood. Memories stirred uninvited. Silas's heavy silence. His habit of watching rather than explaining. The things never spoken after Ezekiel's mother, Dorothy May, had passed. Ezekiel reached out, pressing his palm against the cracked wood. It shifted slightly beneath his touch. Grimlock stomped once, firm and final, like punctuation at the end of a sentence. Ezekiel swallowed. "All right," he murmured, more to himself than the horse. "I'm listening." He grabbed a crowbar from the corner, its metal cold and familiar in his hands. With one hard pull, the plank snapped free, collapsing inward. A narrow cavity revealed itself, carved by human hands, not time. Ezekiel raised the lantern, heart hammering, as the light exposed old fabric, wrapped tight and buried deep. Grimlock stood still now, calm at last, watching as Ezekiel reached inside. When his fingers brushed cold metal beneath the cloth, his breath caught. Whatever had been hidden in this wall had waited decades, and tonight it had decided to be found. Ezekiel Thornwood stood frozen in the lantern's glow, the cold metal object resting heavily in his trembling hands. As he pulled it free from the rotting cloth, time seemed to slow, every creak of the barn amplified by his pounding heart. A pair of weathered military dog tags slid into the light, their dull surface etched with letters that made his breath falter. His name stared back at him, not similar, not familiar, but exact. Ezekiel Thornwood. The barn suddenly felt too small, the air too thin, as if the past itself had stepped forward and demanded to be acknowledged. Grimlock shifted softly behind him, no longer agitated, his task complete. The horse's breathing was calm now, steady, almost reassuring. Ezekiel leaned against the stall door, his knees weak, his mind spiraling. He had never worn a uniform, never been to war. At least, that was the story he had lived by. Yet the weight in his hands said otherwise. The truth pressed against his chest, unfamiliar and terrifying. Something had been taken from him, or hidden, long before he ever had the chance to ask questions. Memories began surfacing in fragments. His father Silas standing silently at the dinner table, eyes distant. The way conversations died whenever Ezekiel asked about family history. The strange gaps in his own childhood memories. Months that felt blurred, like pages torn from a book. His mother Dorothy May used to say, "Some things protect us by staying buried." Ezekiel had never understood what she meant. Now, those words echoed with unbearable clarity. He wrapped the dog tags back into the cloth and carried them inside the house, every step heavy with dread. The kitchen clock read 3:41 a.m. The world outside remained unchanged, indifferent to the storm breaking inside him. Ezekiel sat at the old wooden table, staring at the object he had uncovered, wondering how a life could be built on something incomplete and still feel whole. He poured himself a glass of water, his hand shaking so badly that it spilled onto the table. By morning, sleep never came. The sunrise painted the fields gold, mocking the darkness now rooted in Ezekiel's thoughts. He knew he could not face this alone. One name surfaced again and again, Caleb Wainwright. An old family acquaintance. A man who had known Silas during the years Ezekiel could not remember clearly. Caleb lived only 30 miles away, quiet, reclusive, and deeply tied to the past Ezekiel had avoided all his life. As Ezekiel placed the wrapped dog tags into his coat pocket, his reflection in the window caught his eye. He looked older than he had the night before. He stepped outside, Grimlock watching from the barn, eyes calm but knowing. Ezekiel didn't speak, but the horse followed him with his gaze as the truck engine turned over. Whatever truth waited with Caleb Wainwright, Ezekiel sensed it would not simply answer questions, it would change everything he believed about who he was. The drive to Caleb Wainwright's property felt longer than the miles suggested. Ezekiel Thornwood kept both hands tight on the steering wheel, the wrapped dog tags heavy in his coat pocket, pressing against his ribs with every breath. The road cut through open land scarred by old fences and forgotten barns, places that looked untouched by time or deliberately abandoned.
With each mile, memories stirred again, not as clear scenes but as sensations. The smell of oil and metal, the echo of boots on concrete, the feeling of being watched by men who expected obedience without explanation. Caleb's house sat low against the land, half hidden by cottonwoods and years of neglect. The paint had peeled to bare wood, and a rusted flagpole leaned slightly forward, as if bowing under its own history. When Ezekiel shut off the engine, silence rushed in. He hesitated, heart pounding, then stepped out. Before he could knock, the door opened. Caleb Wainwright stood there already, tall but bent with age, his eyes sharp and unsettlingly alert. "I was wondering when you'd come," Caleb said quietly, his voice gravel-thin. Inside, the house smelled of old books and coffee gone cold. Caleb gestured for Ezekiel to sit, never breaking eye contact. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Ezekiel reached into his pocket and placed the wrapped cloth on the table. Caleb did not touch it. He didn't need to. His jaw tightened as he looked away. "Your father swore this day would never come," Caleb muttered. Ezekiel's stomach dropped. "So you know," Ezekiel said. It wasn't a question. Caleb leaned back, eyes drifting toward the window. "You weren't supposed to remember," he said. "None of you were." Ezekiel felt heat rise in his chest. "Remember what?" Caleb exhaled slowly. "The training, the testing, the things done in the name of protection." Ezekiel's hands clenched. He had lived his life believing he was ordinary. Rancher, husband, son. Now every word Caleb spoke chipped away at that certainty. Caleb finally reached for the cloth, unfolding it with care. The dog tags glinted softly in the dim light. "Your name was used early," Caleb said. "Too early, before you were old enough to consent. Your father thought he was saving you by burying it." Ezekiel shook his head. "Saving me from what?" Caleb's eyes hardened. From becoming something he could never forgive himself for allowing. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in. Ezekiel stood abruptly, breath shallow. "You're telling me my life was redirected without my knowing," he said. Caleb nodded once. Redirected and erased. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Ezekiel realized then that whatever had been buried in that barn wall was only the beginning. The truth was larger, darker, and it had already started to reclaim him. Ezekiel Thornwood left Caleb Wainwright's house with his thoughts splintered and his sense of self shaken beyond recognition. The sky had darkened with low, rolling clouds, pressing down on the land as if mirroring the weight in his chest. He drove without direction for several miles, the engine humming while Caleb's words echoed again and again in his mind. Redirected and erased. The phrase clung to him like a stain. If his past had been altered, then every decision he believed he had made freely now felt uncertain, fragile, almost borrowed. He pulled the truck to the side of the road and shut off the engine. Silence returned, thick and uncomfortable. Ezekiel rested his forehead against the steering wheel, images flashing uninvited. Unfamiliar rooms, men speaking in low voices, a younger version of himself standing still while being observed. None of it was clear enough to call memory, yet it felt too specific to be imagination. His hands trembled as he reached for the dog tags again, the metal cold, undeniable. His name, his blood, his life altered without his consent. By the time Ezekiel reached the ranch, dusk had settled. Grimlock stood near the barn entrance, head lifted as if he had been waiting. The horse snorted softly when Ezekiel approached, their eyes meeting in a moment of silent understanding. Inside the barn, Ezekiel replaced the loose boards temporarily, his movements slow and deliberate. He was not ready to expose that cavity to the daylight. Not yet. Some truths demanded darkness before they could be faced. That night, sleep came in fragments. Ezekiel drifted in and out, plagued by dreams that felt disturbingly real. He saw his father Silas Younger arguing with men in uniform. He heard his mother Dorothy May crying behind a closed door. In one moment, a hand pressed firmly against his shoulder, guiding him forward. In another, the same hand pulled him back. He woke each time drenched in sweat, his heart racing, unsure which moments belonged to memory and which belonged to fear. The following morning, Ezekiel found himself drawn to the old trunk in the attic, a place he had avoided since his parents' deaths. Dust coated everything, the air thick with neglect. Inside the trunk, beneath folded linens and yellowed letters, he found a sealed envelope addressed in his father's handwriting. His name stared back at him, heavier than any dog tag. His fingers hovered, hesitation gripping him. Some part of him already knew opening it would change the shape of his life. As Ezekiel descended the attic steps with the envelope in hand, the house creaked softly around him, as if aware of what was unfolding. Outside, Grimlock let out a low, steady breath. Ezekiel paused at the bottom step, staring at the letter. Whatever Silas Thornwood had tried to bury was no longer content to remain silent, and Ezekiel understood now that the next truth would not be spoken by strangers, but by the man who had raised him. Ezekiel Thornwood sat alone at the kitchen table, the sealed envelope resting inches from his hands. Morning light filtered through the window, casting long shadows that stretched across the wood like silent witnesses. His father's handwriting stared back at him, steady, deliberate, unmistakable. Silas Thornwood had never been a man of excess words. If he had written this letter, then every sentence inside mattered. Ezekiel drew a slow breath, steadying himself, and finally broke the seal. The letter began without comfort. If you are reading this, it means I failed to keep the past buried. Ezekiel felt his throat tighten. Silas wrote of fear, not of enemies or war, but of institutions that claimed to protect while quietly consuming lives. He wrote of men who believed certain children carried potential, and of how Ezekiel's name had appeared on a list long before he could understand what that meant. Silas admitted he had agreed at first, convinced it would open doors, offer safety, provide purpose. That belief, he wrote, was his greatest shame. As Ezekiel read on, fragments aligned with the sensations that had haunted him since the night in the barn. Silas described removing Ezekiel from the program before it was complete, falsifying records, burying evidence, literally and figuratively. "I chose to make you ordinary," his father wrote, "because extraordinary comes at a cost no child should pay." Ezekiel's hands shook as he lowered the letter. His entire life, the quiet ranch, the predictable days, the love he had known, had been shaped by a single desperate decision. Anger rose next, sharp and disorienting.
Ezekiel stood abruptly, pacing the kitchen as if movement could burn the truth out of his body. He had been denied something fundamental, not power or prestige, but choice. His father had rewritten his future without asking. And yet, beneath the anger, another feeling stirred. Gratitude. Because despite the deception, Ezekiel had lived a life rooted in soil, not secrecy. In labor, not orders. In love, not control. Outside, Grimlock shifted near the barn, sensing the tension radiating from the house. Ezekiel stepped onto the porch, letter still clutched in his hand. The wind carried the scent of hay and earth, grounding him. He realized then that the question was no longer what had been taken from him, but what remained. The past had shaped him, yes, but it had not owned him completely. As Ezekiel folded the letter and placed it beside the dog tags, a new certainty settled in. Someone else knew this story. Someone else had allowed it to happen. Silas had broken his silence too late to answer for it. But others were still alive. And Ezekiel Thornwood understood now that uncovering the truth was no longer about reclaiming the past. It was about deciding what kind of man he would be in the time he had left. The decision did not arrive as a dramatic declaration, but as a quiet weight settling into Ezekiel Thornwood's chest. He did not announce it aloud. He simply knew he could no longer remain still. The letter from his father and the dog tags lay side by side on the table, symbols of a life diverted and a truth delayed. Ezekiel poured himself black coffee he did not taste, his eyes fixed on the grain of the wood, as if the table itself might offer guidance. Silence had shaped his life. Now, silence felt like surrender. By late morning, Ezekiel was on the road again, heading toward the county records office in town. The building was old, brick-lined, and perpetually overlooked, the kind of place where forgotten details went to sleep and stayed there. As he walked inside, the smell of paper and dust stirred something familiar. Rows of filing cabinets stood like sentries guarding the past. Ezekiel introduced himself calmly, requesting access to records tied to a defunct agricultural grant program from decades earlier. The clerk barely glanced at him. Ordinary men were rarely questioned. Hours passed as Ezekiel sifted through brittle folders and faded forms. Most were meaningless: crop yields, land transfers, tax adjustments. Then he found it. A reference buried in an appendix. A partnership between local landholders and a federal behavioral assessment initiative. The language was vague, sanitized, intentionally dull. But one name caught his eye: Major Franklin Boone Holloway. Ezekiel felt a chill. Caleb had mentioned him only once, with unmistakable bitterness. A man who didn't erase records, he buried people inside them. Driving home, Ezekiel replayed moments from his life that suddenly felt recontextualized. His aversion to loud authority. His instinctive resistance to being directed. His comfort in isolation. Traits he had believed were personal quirks now appeared cultivated, then abandoned mid-growth. That knowledge unsettled him more than anger ever could. He wasn't broken. He had been interrupted. That night, Ezekiel returned to the barn, lantern in hand. Grimlock stood waiting, ears forward, eyes calm. Ezekiel spoke softly, telling the horse nothing specific, yet everything at once. The animal listened without judgment, breathing slow and steady. Ezekiel pressed his palm to Grimlock's neck, grounding himself. Whatever had awakened the horse that night had not been random. Instinct had recognized buried danger before reason could. As Ezekiel extinguished the lantern and stepped back into the dark, one thought remained painfully clear. Major Holloway was still alive. And if Ezekiel Thornwood had been altered, redirected, and erased, he had not been the only one. The truth was larger than his family, larger than his ranch. And Ezekiel understood now that seeking answers would not simply reopen old wounds. It would force them into the light, where consequences could no longer be avoided. Ezekiel Thornwood did not sleep that night. The name Franklin Boone Holloway repeated in his thoughts with the rhythm of a ticking clock, steady and merciless. By dawn, the sky washed pale gray. Ezekiel was already dressed, his resolve sharpened into something cold and deliberate. He had spent his life working the land, learning patience, endurance, and restraint. But patience, he now understood, was not the same as passivity. Some truths demanded pursuit. Holloway lived outside town, according to the county records, in a converted estate once used for government retreats. The drive there carried a strange familiarity, as if Ezekiel's body remembered routes his mind could not. When he arrived, the property felt sealed off from the world. Trimmed hedges, private signage, security cameras that tracked movement without announcement. Ezekiel parked openly. If he was being watched, he wanted it known. He stepped out slowly, shoulders squared, a rancher's posture hiding a storm beneath. The door was answered by a woman who introduced herself as Holloway's assistant, her smile polite but rehearsed. Ezekiel requested a meeting by name, calm and firm. Minutes passed. Then more. Finally, a tall man appeared in the hallway behind her. Silver-haired, broad-shouldered despite age, eyes sharp with recognition. Major Franklin Boone Holloway studied Ezekiel like an equation already solved. "You're not supposed to be here," Holloway said quietly. Ezekiel met his gaze. "Neither was the truth," he replied. Inside the office, the air felt controlled, sterile, intentionally neutral. Holloway spoke first, framing the past as necessity, sacrifice, protection of national interest. Ezekiel listened, unmoving. Then he placed the dog tags on the desk. The metal clink echoed louder than it should have. Holloway's expression shifted, just slightly, but it was enough. "You took children," Ezekiel said. "You erased lives before they began." Holloway did not deny it. He justified it. As Holloway spoke, Ezekiel felt something settle into place. There was no dramatic confession coming. No apology. Men like Holloway didn't regret, they calculated. Ezekiel stood, the chair scraping softly behind him. "You didn't just fail," Ezekiel said. "You planted something that never stopped growing." Holloway's eyes hardened. "You should leave," he said, "before you make this difficult." Ezekiel walked out without another word. Outside, the air felt thinner, charged. He understood now that justice would not come voluntarily. The truth would need witnesses, records, voices. And as he drove away, Ezekiel realized this was no longer about what had been done to him, but about what was still being protected. Somewhere, others carried gaps in their lives just like his. And Ezekiel Thornwood had decided he would not let them remain buried. The drive back from Franklin Boone Holloway's estate felt heavier than the road itself. Ezekiel Thornwood kept his eyes forward, but his mind replayed every word, every pause, every calculated silence. Holloway had not denied anything, and that, more than anger, terrified him. Men who believed they were right never bothered to hide. The sun dipped low as Ezekiel crossed familiar land, shadows stretching long across the fields, reminding him how easily things disappeared when the light shifted. By the time he reached the ranch, dusk had settled. Grimlock stood near the fence, watching Ezekiel approach, ears forward, posture calm but alert. Ezekiel rested his forehead briefly against the horse's neck, breathing in the familiar scent of hay and dust. He realized then how much this place, this life, had anchored him. Without it, the fragments of his past might have consumed him whole. Instead, they now sharpened his focus. That night, Ezekiel opened the old filing cabinet he hadn't touched in years. Inside were land deeds, tax papers, and correspondence his father had saved without explanation. Digging deeper, Ezekiel found names repeated across decades, Caleb Wainwright among them, and others he barely remembered. One stood out, Jonah Pike Mercer. The name appeared beside handwritten notes, dates, and cryptic references to relocation and compliance. Ezekiel's breath slowed. This wasn't just his story. It never had been. He called Caleb before doubt could creep back in. The old man's voice was tired but steady. When Ezekiel spoke Jonah's name, silence filled the line. Then Caleb exhaled slowly. "You found him," he said. Ezekiel frowned. "You know where he is?" Caleb hesitated. "I know where he was," he replied. "And why no one was supposed to look." Ezekiel felt the ground shift beneath him again. Sleep came reluctantly, haunted by dreams of faces without names and names without faces. In one dream, Ezekiel stood in a long hallway, doors lining both sides, each marked only by a number. He woke before he could open any of them. At dawn, resolve replaced exhaustion. He packed a small bag, gathering documents, letters, copies of records, proof that could not be dismissed as coincidence. As Ezekiel stepped onto the porch, Grimlock snorted softly, as if sensing departure before it happened. Ezekiel paused, hand resting on the doorframe, looking back at the ranch that had been both refuge and blindfold. He did not know what he would find when he followed Jonah Pike Mercer's trail, only that it would force the truth into daylight. And once seen, some truths refused to be buried again. The road leading to Jonah Pike Mercer's last known address narrowed into cracked asphalt and dust, cutting through a stretch of land that felt forgotten by time. Ezekiel Thornwood drove slowly, every sense alert, the weight of expectation pressing harder with each mile. Caleb's directions had been vague by necessity, an old mill town, mostly abandoned, where people learned not to ask questions. Ezekiel understood that places like this didn't just hide people, they absorbed them. The building stood at the edge of town, a former veterans' housing complex converted into cheap rentals. Paint peeled from the walls, and the windows reflected the sky like dull, unseeing eyes. Ezekiel parked and stepped out, the air thick with the smell of rust and rain-soaked concrete. Inside, a woman at the front desk looked up briefly, uninterested. Ezekiel gave Jonah's name. Her fingers paused over the keyboard. That hesitation told him everything. "Second floor," she said quietly. "End of the hall." The hallway was long and dim, lit by flickering bulbs. Ezekiel's boots echoed with each step, his heart pounding louder than the sound. When he reached the door, he hesitated, not from fear, but from the knowledge that whatever waited on the other side would erase the last illusion of distance between past and present. He knocked once, then again. Finally, the door creaked open. Jonah Pike Mercer stood before him, thinner than Ezekiel expected, eyes sharp but guarded. There was recognition there, not of Ezekiel's face, but of his presence, of what he represented. "You shouldn't be here," Jonah said softly. Ezekiel nodded. "I know," he replied, "but neither should you." Silence stretched between them before Jonah stepped aside, allowing Ezekiel in. Inside, the apartment was bare, meticulously ordered, almost sterile. Jonah spoke carefully, choosing each word as if it might be used against him later. He confirmed what Ezekiel already suspected, the assessments, the conditioning, the abrupt removals. Jonah hadn't been spared like Ezekiel. He had been finished. "They took everything," Jonah said. "Then they called it service." His voice never rose, but the damage was evident in every controlled breath. As Ezekiel listened, the final pieces locked into place. His father hadn't just saved him, he had doomed others by staying silent. The realization burned deeper than anger. When Ezekiel stood to leave, Jonah spoke again. "If you tell this story," he said, "they'll come for you." Ezekiel met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "Then they'll have to answer," he said. Outside, the sky darkened, heavy with the promise of reckoning. Ezekiel Thornwood returned to his ranch just before dawn, the horizon pale and quiet, as if the world itself had paused to listen. The drive back had been long, but his thoughts were clear for the first time in weeks. Jonah Pike Mercer's words echoed in his mind, not as a warning, but as a responsibility. Silence had protected powerful men for decades. Ezekiel understood now that truth did not need permission to exist, only a voice willing to carry it. He spent the morning organizing everything he had gathered: the letter from Silas, the dog tags, county records, names, dates, and Jonah's testimony carefully written in his own steady hand. There was no drama in the process, no anger fueling his movements, only precision. Ezekiel contacted a veteran advocacy group first, then an investigative journalist known for pursuing stories others abandoned. He did not embellish. He did not accuse. He simply laid the truth out, piece by piece, trusting its weight to speak for itself. By afternoon, Ezekiel stood in the barn once more. Grimlock watched him from the stall, calm and grounded, the same presence that had started it all. Ezekiel rested his hand against the horse's neck, gratitude settling into his chest. "You knew," he murmured softly. Grimlock shifted, breathing slow and steady. The barn no longer felt like a place of secrets. The wall had been repaired properly this time, not to hide anything, but to restore what had been broken. Days later, the calls began. Questions. Confirmations. Other names surfaced. Other lives echoed Jonah's. Ezekiel did not seek recognition, nor did he hide. When Sheriff Luther Crow came by to ask what Ezekiel knew, Ezekiel answered plainly. The truth no longer frightened him. It steadied him. For the first time, he felt fully present in his own life, not redirected, not erased, but chosen. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields gold, Ezekiel sat on the porch, the past finally quiet behind him. He thought of his father, not with anger, but with understanding. Silas had acted out of love and fear, imperfectly, desperately. Ezekiel had spent a lifetime shaped by that choice. Now, he had reshaped its ending. The story no longer belonged to secrecy or regret. As night settled, Grimlock let out a low, peaceful breath from the barn. Ezekiel listened, feeling something close at last, not closure born from forgetting, but from facing what was buried and choosing differently. The past had been uncovered. The truth had been spoken. And Ezekiel Thornwood understood, with calm certainty, that a life reclaimed was not defined by what had been taken, but by what one chose to do once everything was finally known.